Howdy, my name is Zach Bursch. I'm a third-year pre-service English educator at the University of Nebraska here in Lincoln. What you're about to listen to is the final assignment from my Composition Theory and Practice course, as taught by the ever-so-wonderful Rachel Shaw. This assignment was titled The Unfive-Paragraph Essay, in which our whole class was challenged to write and produce an essay that breaks the form of the traditional 5-paragraph essay and deals with some interesting and personal way that we, the class, each individually think about the writing classroom. My Unfive is about the undervaluation of voice in the English classroom, how voice is intrinsically tied to identity, and a proposed idea of fluency as a partner to our current understanding of literacy. In the next 40-ish minutes, I'll argue for some ways in which we can teach voice explicitly, and I'll be attempting to do so in some pretty fun ways if I do say so myself. I mean, I can't give it all away in the first 2 minutes. Have some patience. We'll get to it. Grab a snack, something warm to drink, a pen, some paper, and strap in for the fruits of entirely too many hours of academic labor. When I think of an English classroom, a very distinct image comes to my mind. It starts with the color blue, the color I associate most with the subject, paired with the dim lighting of candles and the comfort of reading corners with bean bags and banned books. My mind then wanders to classwork. Free writes, essays, grammar worksheets, book reports, assignments I've done hundreds of times over, reading and writing. I'm brought back to English teachers I've loved throughout the years. Julie Larson, Caleb Narva, Robert Caraher. I see desks filled with my unattentive peers and a whiteboard filled with terms I'd never remember and concepts I'd never forget. I find myself wandering through this ephemeral classroom whenever I get to thinking about this profession, this love I have chosen to commit my life to. While the image of an English classroom in my head is fond and nostalgic, it is far from perfect. Reading and writing. Two pieces of a puzzle that everyone in the sphere of education seems to think is complete. We look at an image with a gaping void in its center and think to ourselves, yeah, that's about right, because seemingly nobody has come along to tell us that the job's not done. A house can't stand on two pillars, and the fact that this one has for so long can only mean one of two things. Either A, we as teachers have been holding this collapsing building on our backs like Spider-Man from Homecoming, or B, this isn't a house, but a construction site for a building that, while incomplete, has been in use for long enough that OSHA has definitely noticed. Realistically, it's somewhere in between A and B. Call it the 8.5. In this lost plot of an analogy, I am OSHA. What's there isn't bad or broken, but it sure as shit is missing a vital third piece. A piece that is near and dear to my heart, and a large reason for my wanting to teach this subject. Truly, it's a large reason for my wanting to teach at all. This piece is voice. In my eyes, voice is a lot of things. Too many for any one definition or school of thought to catch it all, but before it's any of those things, it's the sounds we string together to make words. Speaking is a ridiculously simple task for most people, but doing so intentionally and with skill takes work and effort. Work and effort that is wasted, or at the very least inefficient, if not framed as a skill. English curriculum as it stands in Lincoln Public Schools, the district I find myself in proximity to, has their foot in the door in this regard, requiring an oral communication class as a stipulation for graduation. But that, in and of itself, is my complaint here. Public school students are generally required to take 13 years of English courses, from kindergarten all the way up through senior year of high school. Then, any person who wants to get a degree is further required to take another 1 to 3 English courses before they can get that degree, with some variance based on whatever major a person decides upon. The ability to use language effectively is at the cornerstone of what it is to exist effectively in society. Of course, people that can't use language find a way to communicate just as well, but if given the choice between language and another non-standard method of communication, I feel like I'd be hard-pressed to find someone that'd choose the latter. We text and sign documents, we read subtitles and street signs, but more than any of that, we talk to each other. According to a 2025 study conducted by National University, 21% of US adults are illiterate, which means that a fifth of the country's adults, 1 in 5 adult people in this country, only use their voice when interacting with this language. If I were to ask 100 random people on the street if they read, write, or talk more, gun to my head, I can guarantee you the largest slice of that pie chart is going to read talk in bold letters. With all that being said, I find it baffling that throughout those 13 years of schooling, my district finds it suitable to only require 1 semester of coursework in this regard. I can't speak for every English teacher or class, but as it stands, there is no arguing that English curriculum is equally focused on writing, reading, and speaking across the board. The idea of voice pops up in different ways across the literacy-focused facets of English, but would it not be more effective to teach voice as a part of the conversation, as opposed to something that just kind of gets brought up when talking about other things entirely? In other words, if voice and speech are such vital parts of language, then I have one more question to ask you. Why the fuck are we not teaching students how to use it? Reading and writing are fundamental subjects that teach relevant and highly important skills, but when we teach kids how to create and present an argument by handing them a 5-slot Mad Lib and call it a 5-paragraph essay, we aren't exactly setting them up for success. Writing is good and all, but when your girlfriend traps you into a "would you love me if I was a worm" hypothetical, you better hope you can talk your way out of that one. We, as teachers of the most dominant method of communication in the world, have a duty to our students to teach them how to use it effectively. While I understand every district is different, thinking back to elementary and middle school, I have no recollection of ever being made to talk in my English courses. Of course, we answered questions when we were asked and talked about classwork with elbow partners, but nowhere in my mind is an assignment asking me to talk through a topic or create an argument with my spoken words. This isn't to say it never happened, memory is fallible, of course, but it is to say that if it did, it wasn't significant enough to get committed into long-term memory, and that is a problem. Hell, in my memories of high school, all I can think up in relation to voice-based assignments are theater classes and a singular assignment in an AP course asking me to create and present an argumentative speech while adhering to a similarly mind-numbing and thoughtless cookie-cutter template. Every year throughout my college experience, I have witnessed geniuses in my classes and the spaces I occupy on campus fumble over their own thoughts about a topic they are an expert in because they don't know how to use their voice effectively. I think you get my point. If it isn't clear yet, I think that voice is important to incorporate into core English curriculum because so many people have it and don't know how to use it effectively. What's the point in deviating spoken word from reading and writing when it all comes back to the exact same discipline? All this talk is well and good, but let me put my money where my mouth is before I start waxing poetic about theory and new, old ideas about tone and diction. Here are my credentials. I'm not just a pre-service English teacher. I'm one hell of a speaker. What you're about to hear is a speech I presented to the Lincoln, Nebraska legislature in relation to a bill that was being proposed which would effectively neuter teachers' ability to teach about any part of history without being forced to censor and redact real human experiences because they promoted an ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
My name is Zachary H. Bursch, that is Zackary Hbursh, and I am many things. I'm a black man from Omaha, Nebraska. I am an educator, I'm a boxer, I'm autistic, and I, like so many other of the black men and women that came from North Omaha, am filled with an unrelenting anger every single day of my life. I wake up and I get to read the news every morning, where I'm told every day that me and people like me, people like the men and women in this room don't matter. As a future educator, but one that is not incompetent by any means, I am appalled by the existence of this bill, not the conversation surrounding it, not the opinions that are taken on it, by the fact that it exists. When I think DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I don't think a lot of the things that I feel like a lot of the people in this room think. I think of women's suffrage. I think of the civil rights movement. It's been mentioned many times today that we didn't have a DEI office for so long, but that's because it wasn't called DEI. It was called those things. The civil rights movement is diversity, equity, and inclusion. The purpose of equity is not to give those who have more, it is to establish equality. The end goal of equity is equality. I am a biracial man. If I was born 20 years earlier, my parents would have been killed in the streets and I burned at birth. My folks from Louisiana, they were both raised Baptist and Pentecostal Christian. And when my brother was born, the things they had to endure just on the virtue of the fact that they were a black man and a white woman together having a child would give some of y'all nightmares. And I get to exist. And I get to be here. And the fact that I get to be here, where I am, talking to y'all the way that I am, without fear of persecution, without fear of being lynched the second I walk out of here, is because of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm allowed to be in this room because of DEI. Omaha, Nebraska, where I come from, she is my first love. I love the neighborhoods I grew up on, I love the restaurants I got to go to, and I love the students that are there. But the reason I will never teach in Omaha Public Schools is because its administration time and time again has shown its teachers that it does not care about them. Omaha as a city was built on the backs of several people, wave after wave after wave, and North O and South O, where I and my Latino brothers and sisters call home, are the places in which the poorest have always lived. There weren't always black in North O, there wasn't always Latino in South O. It used to be the Polish, and then it was the Jewish, then it was the Russian. Time and time again, the lowest rung of society as they came into society were put in these places. That is something I could not share with y'all without DEI. That is a lesson that as an educator I could not teach under the existence of this bill. So I ask you all to oppose it. Because if you don't, you're spitting in the face of everything that education is, was, and will be.
That was pretty gas, right? I ate that the fuck up. What I didn't tell you, though, is that not a damn word of that speech was written down beforehand. I entered this hearing with absolutely no intention of speaking. I went in solidarity to my brothers and sisters on campus, and in place of many educators I know that couldn't be there. That was a speech born from the anger that festered in my stomach while I listened to the bullshit of angry, red-in-the-face men that would see me lynched upon leaving. This is an example of extemporaneous verbal speech, or the idea of being able to present an argument, answer a question, or say something with substance without needing preparation or research. It's off the cuff, it's passionate, it's personal. Extemporaneous verbal speech, or EVS, is the type of speech students I have worked with in past have struggled with the most. Be it answering a question when called on, being asked what's next in relation to writing a paper, or defending the bold claims high schoolers are known for. More often than not, students have answers or things to say in these contexts, but they need to mutter through filler words and further prompting to get there. The most recent example of this I've encountered was a 9th grader I worked closely with on the American Creed writing project. We'll call her Amira. The American Creed Writing Project is one of many of the National Writing Project's youth writing projects that fall under the Writing Our Future initiative, according to NWP's website. The project itself stems from a PBS documentary of the same name, which aired in February of 2018. The film and the project both tackle the ideas and concepts of what it is to be an American. Freedom, liberty, culture, all the things that make Americans Americans. I got a chance to work with Amira through my pre-service education degree program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and together, I helped her throughout the process of writing her essay. Amira's project tied back to her roots as an Iraqi immigrant who experienced public schooling in the U.S. for the entirety of her compulsory education. Her essay talks about what it was like to be ostracized for reasons she didn't even understand as a little girl, and to have little to no support from a system that, at the time, was not adequately suited to benefit a young woman who was playing catch-up just trying to learn the language, let alone everything else. She delves into how being an immigrant shaped her perspective on this country, and the ways in which she wishes her schooling had been different, as well as all the ways she's seen the culture surrounding bullying and discrimination change in public schooling across her lifetime. It was an amazing essay that received critical acclaim from her classmates, teachers, me, and even a member of the National Writing Project who got a chance to see it read. That being said, throughout the entire writing process, Amira had two distinct and persistent hang-ups. The first, when prompted to answer questions in relation to her life and her writing, she required continuous further prompting to arrive at an answer that contained everything she wanted to say. And when prompted to write about these answers, she would freeze up and ask what she should write, even in instances where we had been talking about the next steps for her project for an extended period of time. I believe these two things stem from the same core issue: confidence. Now, this isn't to say that Amira wasn't a confident young woman. She knew exactly who she was and had no qualms about telling you. When I say confidence is the issue here, I mean specifically confidence in her voice. Like any other skill, to gain confidence in your voice, you have to practice, and practice intentionally. Amira had an amazing, complex, and powerful thoughts that turned into a wonderful paper. She just wasn't in tune with her voice well enough to know how to express these thoughts quickly or without second-guessing her own voice. This issue of confidence is something I've seen in just about every student I've worked with in relation to fluency, but it's not something I ever saw in myself. My ability to use my voice was born at the same time I was, in a sense. It's a fundamental part of my being, my blackness and the baggage that comes with it. There is an anger that exists in the black community, a flame that has been fostered for generations. This anger consumes a lot of us, but just as many, if not more, use this anger as a tool, a fuel source for the changes we want to see in our country, in our communities. That anger is what gave me my voice. Nobody intentionally taught me how to use this anger, but somebody definitely did teach me. It didn't happen in a classroom, but in my childhood home. My teacher? My asshole brother, Kobe. One of the perks of having a Kobe is that growing up, I was constantly on the ropes. He is 6 years on me, and as such, he had 6 years of knowledge that I simply didn't as a dumb little shit-for-brains rugrat. So as I grew up and we argued constantly, I slowly began to learn what logical fallacies were. I learned how to form arguments brick by brick through combined hours of being made to realize how dumb I was. I began to pick up on when he was bullshitting. I learned how to tear holes in his flawed logic, and eventually I figured out how to argue the same way he did. That wasn't the end of it though. We kept arguing. Years went by with us on par on the verbal battlefield of shared bedrooms and basement couches. And the whole time we were growing our capacity for language utilization without even knowing it. You give me a topic, 10 minutes of prep time, and a direction in which to point my anger, and I can go toe-to-toe with the best of them. So then the question becomes this. If my whole ethos for why I'm qualified to talk about voice in the classroom stems from skills learned outside of the classroom, what the fuck am I getting at? How does that anecdote help Amira and students like her who don't have Kobe's or the stubbornness to argue with their siblings for 13 years? Well, in this essay, I will... Nah, I'm fucking with you. What I'm getting at is that although my experience with learning how to effectively use language was non-standard at best and anecdotal bullshit at worst, the skills I picked up and the root of how they were acquired can be used to help our students become more well-rounded communicators, both on and off the page. Over the next however long this thing is, I hope to leave you with some ideas of how to get your kiddos talking in and out of your classroom that'll hopefully help us help the Amiras out there gain enough confidence in their voices to say what they mean and write what they say. Voice is identity. More specifically, voice is a medium for individual expression of identity. Think about the things that you say. Yeah, you listening, whether you're an educator or not. Whenever you express an opinion, that's you voicing a thought that was formed and informed by information you absorbed that was then processed through the filters that are the very identities you occupy. Whatever the opinion may be, it has roots intrinsically tied to who you are. Hell, even the way you may voice that opinion changes based on your identities and the identities of your audience, which is a topic we'll cover later. If you think everything I've said up to this point is bullshit, that could be because you have empirical evidence saying I'm wrong, or because you have a philosophy that contrasts with mine, which, in and of itself, is a facet of your identity. The same thing goes for arguments, seeing as an argument is just an opinion that you're trying to convince someone of. And while it may be to a lesser degree, the same can be said for shooting the shit with a friend, asking questions to a professor, or even just repeating a song that's stuck in your head. All of these things are, in some way, influenced by the person you are and the spaces you find yourself occupying, your identity. It's this definition that should inform how we go about teaching our kiddos how to tap into their own voice, use it, and gain the confidence to never stop. There's a concept I've been referring to as fluency in my research, which is a term I use in accompaniment with the term literacy. Yes, I know this is a word we already use as educators to refer to a couple things, but so is voice. So, yeah. Literacy encapsulates half the basic language skills, reading and writing, whereas fluency traditionally captures only a fourth, speaking. For the sake of not inventing new terminology, though, when I use the word fluency, I'm referring to the other half of basic language skills, both speaking and listening. I see the four skills as two sets of parallels. Writing and speaking are both forms of content and language generation, and reading and listening are both forms of content/language absorption. As I've stressed up to this point, modern-day English curriculum is focused almost entirely on literacy and not nearly as much on fluency. While we do stress clarity in student writing and do our best to promote reading comprehension in the classroom, these skills don't transfer as directly to being able to speak articulately and listen attentively as we might like to believe. There is a definitive overlap in principle behind the skills utilized in articulate speech and concise writing. But there arises an issue in expecting the overlap to be direct. In the classroom, traditionally, we are only allowing our kiddos to practice their language skills in literacy-centric mediums. The only slight caveat to this is that students talk and listen every day. The reason this podcast is focused primarily on speaking and voice as opposed to both facets of fluency is because we, as people who are constantly consuming media and listening to each other, develop listening comprehension innately by existing in the perpetually noisy society that we live in. Sure, most people talk pretty frequently, but there's no arguing that people talk more than they listen, because we simply don't. Hell, referring to a 2024 study conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average American only spends 35 minutes talking on the daily. Now, of course, there are obvious outliers in this regard. Hell, we're outliers as educators. We practically don't shut up. Still, the numbers don't lie, and many of our students will go on to be these average Americans. There's obviously a range of skill in regard to how well people listen. No two people are identical, after all, but students are already getting practice with their listening skills on a near constant basis in their day-to-day. With that said, this idea of fluency is the real underlying missing piece to modern English education, not just voice, and I wouldn't feel right putting this project out into the world without stressing that we, as teachers of English, need to be framing both speaking and listening as skills that are worked on rather than just things that we all do. With that out of the way, what else is voice? After all, it's not just this idea of identity. There are some obvious answers to this question that I'm sure you're familiar with, but none of them serve as a solid lens for thinking about voice as educators designing curriculum, nor do they serve as a solid lens for convincing students that voice is important. There's the structural answer of diction, detail, imagery, syntax, and tone. These are, after all, the components of voice that we talk about in reference to the written voice. There's also the structural answer of pitch, pace, volume, pause, tone, but again, articulation and inflection, which are the notable components of spoken voice that receive attention in singing and acting courses. There's the way we as teachers currently think about voice, which includes the active voice, i.e. the dog chased the cat, the passive voice, i.e. the cat was chased by the dog, style, attitude, and character voice. And this is essentially how the ACT frames voice. And finally, there's the literal definition of the sound produced in a person's larynx and uttered through the mouth as speech or song, as stated by Oxford Languages. None of these definitions cover it all. While they're important, especially the way we define voice in the writing classroom, these components are far from the full picture. English teachers do a bang-up job covering the majority of the stuff I just mentioned. There are ample standards and coursework baked into English curricula to cover the structural aspects of voice, as well as the varying definitions of voice we teach in the writing classroom. But what we're missing as English teachers are real, tangible ways for our students to explore their voice, their English. I mean, think about what we're teaching them in the long term. It's one thing to be able to write a bang-up essay or to be able to eloquently and efficiently dissect the musings of Milton or Shakespeare, but it's another thing entirely to be able to communicate these ideas with another person, face to face. Just in case you're still not convinced of my whole voices identity soapbox, I've got one more thing that might do the job. When I first had this idea, I wanted to figure out some way to prove it. So I conducted an interview. Well, technically I conducted 2 with the plan to conduct 3, but being honest, this podcast is an assignment with a deadline that I would not meet if I attempted to conduct and synthesize all 3. Can you believe I initially wanted to do 6? Ugh, chills. Anyways, Kenji Madison is the Director of Student Culture and Community at the Jackie Gone Multicultural Center here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, as well as a graduate professor of psychology. At least, that's what he is entitled. To me, he's a mentor, a colleague, and a friend. He's reached out to me in moments where nobody else even realized I needed to be reached out to. He's made sure I could access food in times where I was uncertain when my next meal was coming, and he's been a sounding board for every step of my academic journey since I met him. Kenji has been one of the very few masculine presences in my life, and he first showed up at a point in time where my father, the only other black man in my life, was an hour away. Needless to say, I've learned a lot from this man, which definitely informed my choice to interview him. What does voice mean to you?
Yeah, what a heavy question, and it's interesting how my mind immediately goes back to childhood. And I grew up in what we consider to be an impoverished community, but we weren't poverty-stricken. Mm-hmm. Grew up in a full household with mother and father, and strict, extremely strict home. It's what Dad says, it goes, and there was no questioning. And if there was a moment when you reached outside of those bounds, he physically brought you back in. And so growing up, voice was non-existent, and I mean the external voice. There was a lot of internal struggles from a voice perspective, and unfortunately that voice, that internalized voice, was built out of hatred. And that's what I learned early, is that the suppression of my voice moved me to hate the one who suppressed it. And that was my own father. And that's an interesting dynamic to when you don't have a real conversational relationship with your father. And I use that because that's the jump off to what I understood voice to be, is voice was permission based. Did I tell you when to talk? Did I ask you anything? That type of thing. So even in school, as I go through school, I never spoke in class. Not because I didn't know, but because permission wasn't granted to me. Even if the teacher, instructor, professor said, does anyone know? You didn't specifically ask Kenji. So I learned early is that you don't speak unless you're spoken to. In my transition to the military, I did a full career in the military, and that was further emboldened into my psyche, is that you speak when spoken to. And the hatred and then it began to grow into this unsatisfaction that I had as a person, is the expression of voice was this external function of somebody being not only uncomfortable with themselves or comfortable with themselves. And so I'm fighting these things here. So at the onset of who I am, Kenji Madison, voice was a modicum of power, hatred, suppression, that thing. And I didn't begin to transition until my military career, once I began to get rank, and I understood that my voice carries some quote unquote authority, that I can tell people what to do, and because of my rank, and because I was a bigger guy, my voice a little deeper, that when I put something behind it, people start doing things. And so then voice became this power / abuse. Those type of things there, I began to use it for, because I'm able to yell or command people to do things and they get it done. and it reflect positively on me. So this struggle, I had this real struggle with voice and what it meant. And it was so one-sided, built from, Kenji the child up to Kenji as the adult in the military and doing all these things here. And people lauded me because, doggone it, you get things done when you speak. And then in the back of my head, I'm like, shoot, yeah, I do. So let me do more of it. And the interesting thing, as I retired, as I go into academia, higher level academia, master's and doctoral type of work there, my understanding of voice began to be challenged. And the sitting in the back of the room, with my arms folded, and there are questions taking place, and then somebody directly challenges me, Kenji, I want to know your thoughts on the transition from childhood to middle school to adulthood in terms of loneliness and self-expression. And my face glazes over, and almost a tear begins to form because now it's just challenged what my whole thought process is. And now somebody's asking me in front of everybody to express my thoughts on this. And it forced me to go back to this childhood mind frame where no one actually taught me how to express myself through voice in a way that is productive. And I say productive, just you and I conversing or being able to talk openly with someone without damaging them or calling their manhood, womanhood, or whatever the case may be into question, but to have a real dialogue. And within the confines of the classroom, I was able to begin to form what does it mean to have voice, and voice that is meaningful, but also representative of who you have come to be. So I had to challenge all the things that I was suppressed in not doing as a child to where I am now as a fully grown man with a fully grown family and all kinds of other responsibilities, and being able to actually look at somebody and speak to them in a cogent manner that actually makes sense. It's interesting to be almost 50 years old and still learning how to converse openly with someone and not to be reserved, and understand that, yes, your voice has power, but power to do what now? Is it to make people do jumping jacks, or is it to make people consider? And that's what my meat is today, is in conversation, when I'm speaking, is to have people consider whatever it is we're speaking of, and consider Kenji's point of view, and that my point of view is acceptable. And even if it is challenged, it's okay, because the challenge is out of this place of love, understanding, whatever the case may be. So long convoluted, but it started as a child and even now continues today into what, when, and how I begin to understand what voice is and means to me. Now with my own family, voice is everything, because it's forced the way that I interact with my wife, my son, and my daughter, is to not repeat the things from the past, but to speak to them in a manner that empowers them, challenges them, but does so respectfully and with love. That's the beautiful transition there through voice, is that you can learn along the way, even though if you've built falsehoods within your own self, is that somebody can challenge you lovingly to be able to consider, who are you? Who are you? And your voice has to be able to express who you are. And if it can't, then you have to actually sit and think about who you are. And to accept through voice is that I have some frailties, and to talk through those frailties to hopefully begin to voice the better part of you, if that makes any kind of sense whatsoever.
Do you see why this man was my first choice? Just such rich things to say. Ugh, I love it. After conducting this interview, I did a rudimentary code of it, essentially looking for phrases that evoked a similar meaning or related back to similar core points, noting them, and then pairing those things with the core points. If this was a paper, I'd hand you a graphic organizer on the next page, but because it's not, let's talk through them briefly. In chronological order for both the interview and Kenji's life story, he came to the following realizations of: voice is permission-based, voice is hatred, voice is power, voice is mundane, and voice is love. Kenji's answers were interesting to me for several reasons, starting with the fact that we have two beliefs that tie back to a former facet of Kenji's identity. Voice is permission-based and voice is hatred are both assertions that Kenji denounced and associated with a younger, more childlike version of himself as informed by the power dynamics of his family home at the time. Voice voice is power, voice is mundane, and voice is love are the three that Kenji associated more with a version of himself closer to the present day, and all three can very interestingly be derived from those ideas of permission and hatred. The idea of voice being mundane is in direct contrast to voice being permission-based, as the mundane is something that just sort of happens on the regular. In an effort to deviate from the hatred sparked from the idea of voice being permission-based in Kenji's adult mind, it has become mundane and expected in the home, something to be appreciated. The same goes for voice being love, which is similarly in contrast to voice being hatred. As Kenji has become a husband and a father, his idea of voice in relation to his family stands diametrically opposed to his father's idea of voice. And at the center of it all is this idea of voice being power, the center point between the two pairs of opposed ideas, emerging at a time not dissimilar to his childhood, and also not dissimilar to his station in life now. While the military worked to perpetuate this idea of voice being permission-based, the further Kenji went in his career, the more mundane voice became as he turned into the one issuing the permission. Both ends of that scale end in voice being power, which I would argue is something Kenji still holds on to today as a professor and an academic at a very high caliber. When people hear him talk, they listen, though it's now no longer out of obligation, but intrigue. Another idea Kenji mentioned in this interview. I could go on with this dissection, but I would hope I've gotten my point across by now. Voice is conceptually tied to a person's identity on every level, and oftentimes, the more prevalent an identity and culture, the more sway it has on a person's voice. We even see that idea mirrored in Kenji's interview in the way that he related his personal narrative back to three core points in childhood, the military, and his current priorities, family and academia. Most people attribute a lot of their fundamental nature to their childhood. The military was one of the most definitional times in Kenji's life, and if you were to ask this man what his top priorities are in this life, he'd go on a wonderful rant about his beautiful family and eventually end up talking about the role he plays on UNL's campus. I'd put money on that. With all this in mind, the first step to unlocking your student's voice is getting them to figure out what it is that makes them them. So we've established that A, voice is identity, and B, fluency is the missing half of our focus in the classroom, then we need to figure out how to provide students with opportunities to engage with these topics in mediums that are relevant to the content. This includes identity-based speaking opportunities and assignments that focus on teaching students how to explore voice, identity, and the ways in which those two are connected to language as a whole, not just literacy or fluency. The following activities demonstrate some ways in which we can do all of the above. If you're interested in trying any of these activities, I'd suggest grabbing a pen and paper. Also, large thank you to the work of Vershawn Ashanti Young, as the following three activities were in part derived from his teachings. Okay, but how would you say it though? One thing I've noticed in my community throughout the years I spent in its school system is that, more often than not, students aren't really ever told that they have something to say, or that what they have to say matters. Of course, my view on this is skewed by the shortcomings of the district that raised me, and yours may not have the same shortcomings, but the only anecdotes I have to pull on are my own. Something that's just as important to drive home as the what is the way students say things, the way only they would know how to say it. That's just as important in my eyes. In Vershawn Ashanti Young's article, Should Writers Use Their Own English?, he talks heavily about this idea of deviating from the beliefs upheld by standard English ideology, which he goes on to define as standard language ideology, also called dominant language ideology, is this belief that there is one set of dominant language rules that stem from a single dominant discourse, like standard English, that all writers and speakers of English must conform to in order to communicate effectively. He goes on to explain how the idea of upholding standard language ideology is inherently setting curriculum up to discriminate against students based on their personal and cultural linguistic features. Not only is this belief highly problematic, but it's also unnatural. People develop dialects based on the dialects of their parents and the social groups they inhabit outside of the home. Knowing this, looking at it, and proclaiming that we all need to speak and write one way is inefficient at best and bullshit at worst. What you're about to hear are two clips from the same song as performed by different people. The song? Many Men by 50 Cent. first performed by 50 Cent and then Ben Dunnell. When I play these, I want you to think about the message in these bars. What's being said? How does the presentation of the song influence the inferences you make about what's being said? What are some differences in the two clips, and what might have informed the addition or subtraction of certain lyrics?
Many men wish death upon me. Blood in my eye, dog, and I can't see. I'm trying to be what I'm destined to be, and niggas trying to take my life away. I put a hole in a nigga for fucking with me. My back on the wall, now you gon' see. Better watch how you talk when you talk about me, cause I'll come and take your life away. Many men, many, 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 many.
Many men wish death upon me. Blood in my eye, dog, and I can't see. I'm trying to be what I'm destined to be. They want to take my life away. Many men, many, 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 many men.
Take a second. Think about what all you noticed that was different between these two songs. What you just did is the first step towards helping your students find their voices. I'm sure we've all come across a piece of writing that we really wanted to use as mentor texts for something, but just couldn't squeeze it in or couldn't see a way to make it work in a lesson plan. I think this is the perfect way to utilize those materials. The idea here is that you should assign your students a piece and have them find a video of somebody performing it. Have them note things they notice about the performance, things they liked and things they would do differently if it were them. Then, challenge them to concoct their own performance of the piece, adhering as closely as possible to the way they would speak the piece if they were just talking and not reading. To add another layer of depth, challenge them to first dissect the piece for meaning before figuring out how they would communicate it. After all of that, you've just done a reading assignment, which allows you to teach meaning making and poetic analysis, a research assignment that asks for the opinions and rationales of your students, training their analytical and argumentative writing skills, and a voice assignment that asks them to tap directly into their voice to communicate a common message. This is the type of stuff I'm talking about when I say that literacy and fluency can be used together at the same time. I think it's important to assign your students pieces so that they don't immediately gravitate towards a piece that feels familiar. While it's good for them to be able to point out pieces that sound like them, the purpose of this assignment is locating that voice in a vacuum, without similar voices to draw on. Hell, you could even expand this assignment further and let your students rewrite whatever piece they were assigned in their own English. Let's try another activity. And why should I care? Personally, I think the most compelling arguments are ones that make me believe that the speaker believes whatever they're saying. Now, you don't actually have to believe whatever your argument is when you're arguing something, but if you can convince your audience that you do, then in my eyes, you've successfully argued whatever your point is. What's central to this philosophy is that concept of identity. By tying an argument back to a facet of one's identity, they establish an ethos over their argument, a sense of personal ownership. While an audience can and will criticize certain identities depending on who's speaking, they cannot take your identity from you. No argument is going to land the exact same in two different audiences, and as a speaker, you have to be prepared for that. But at the end of the day, if your argument is braided with an irrefutable part of yourself, then there's only so much someone can argue against it. Unless your argument is, like, really wrong. Rashad Ashanti Young argues something similar in his article, where he says, "But don't nobody's language, dialect, or style make them vulnerable to prejudice. It's attitudes. It'd be the way folks with some power perceive other people's language. Like the way some view, say, Black English when used in school or at work. Black English don't make it own self-oppressed. It'd be negative views about other people using their own language. When you speak or write, you open yourself up to judgment and prejudice, but that should never stop a speaker from saying what they need to say. That's something we gotta ingrain in our kiddos. When I talk about arguments, I don't just mean the traditional argumentative essay with a lukewarm thesis statement and 3 bullshit MLA-cited supporting claims. I mean just about everything. An expressed opinion in a back and forth with your friend is an argument. Persuading your mom to buy you new shoes is likely several arguments. Talking your way out of a speeding ticket is an argument. Just about every sentence with any substance is an argument, in support of one, or a question that is either clarifying somebody else's argument or giving you information you need for your next one. Not every argument has to be some well thought out, incredibly personal, anecdote, narrative driven masterpiece, but when it matters, when it's defending your actions in an HR meeting, when it's an interview for a massive promotion, when it's trying to convince your professor that you actually did deserve points for that answer on your last quiz. It can't hurt to be able to pull on some part of yourself and whatever words you've tucked away in your lexicon to sway the tides of interpersonal opinion in your favor. And at the center of one's ability to do so is that idea of voice as a medium for identity and personal expression. For this activity, you can go down one of two routes, or just do both. The first route is one that hinges on impromptu speaking, or that EVS thing we talked about earlier, extemporaneous verbal speaking. In this activity, you pose your students with a scenario in which they have been brought into question, a scenario that all of our students will find themselves in at some point. The scenario in question being an interview. The challenge is to navigate the interview without putting on a facade or switching up who you actually are. Additionally, students will be challenged to tie their responses to interview questions back to one of their identities in a relevant and supporting way. This could look something like the following. So, candidate, what are your leadership qualifications? Well, sir, I place a very large emphasis on teamwork in my personal endeavors, having been on a basketball team for the better part of my life. My biggest interest on and off the court has always been doing whatever I can to help my teammates flourish, which resulted in me becoming my basketball team's captain for the past 3 years. The idea here is to give your students practice with speaking on the spot, staying true to themselves, and to do it all in a format that will feel relevant to your students. The second route to this activity is to assign your students a point or claim that they must create an argumentative speech around. The goal here is to create and deliver a speech in a way that not only is compelling to the audience, but also compelling to the student speaking. This activity's goal is to really harness that idea of convincing an audience that you, the speaker, believe your point, and to do so by weaving parts of yourself into logic, your narrative, and the way you deliver your speech. Okay, so let's figure it out. Not only is it important that we teach students how to use and discover their own voices, but it's also important that we teach them how to learn about, analyze, and accept each other's dialects. If the goal is to deviate completely from the teachings of dominant language ideology, then our goal needs to be to teach students about as many dialects as possible. This can be done in a lot of ways, but my favorite that I've seen came out of a 2008 high school classroom of one Nora Bergman, as shown on her blog titled, "That's How I Talk." Named after an interjection made by one of her students when on the topic of African American vernacular English, That's How I Talk is a blog home to 2 years worth of linguistic research conducted by her classes. On the homepage lies a video made by Bergman explaining the origin of this blog and how its inception came about. In this video, she highlights 2 students that failed her 9th grade literature and composition class, showcasing their linguistic dissection of the word urban, which at the time bore a lot more social significance than it does now, having been replaced by words like hard, ghetto, and drib. She makes the assertion that if these 2 students have this in-depth of an understanding of this word, urban, then they must have the skills necessary to dissect other parts of language and should have passed her class. Her conclusion? Students have an innate understanding of language and its facets. This understanding just lies in their own English and not in the academic standard vernacular they are expected to learn. I agree with this assertion, and furthermore, I agree with how she went about addressing it. The blogs attached to the homepage are all entries from her students, in which they have compiled their own writings, videos, audio, and research to talk about some facet of language. Selbelt, for example, digs into how, where, and when Chinese people speak Mandarin instead of their native dialects and languages. These entries are guided solely by what interests the students and gets them to engage with language intentionally, framing language research as something they are not only capable of, but something that they can and are actively doing. In many cases, as stated by Bergman, students would choose to do their research over their own or their friends' English, which resulted in a deeper understanding of their own voices. Whichever way you go about it, I think that this kind of linguistic research has a massive place in the classroom. I think a student-led research assignment of this kind is also a great way to teach students about dialects across the country and to challenge them on some of their existing biases for and against certain types of English. Linguistics is another facet of English education that was lacking in my schooling. It was definitely part of the curriculum, but it was never framed as something that ever had any bearing on the lives of me or my classmates. It was this thing that people much smarter than I was did, and that's about all I needed to know. There are an infinite number of ways you could go about injecting voice into your assignments and curriculum. But if I'm being honest, the one thing that has tripped me up in the endeavor that has been this podcast has been grading. My core ideas all have to do with this exploratory concept of finding student voice, but that doesn't have any definable parameters in my mind. Who would I be to critique a student's work where they've dug into every corner of their being trying to define their voice? If voice is a medium for individual expression, then how do we go about grading assignments based on it without having said grades also be reflections on the individual being expressed? Well, conveniently enough, I think my professor for the class in which this podcast is an assignment for said it best in a reading assigned to us on this very topic: grading. The paper is titled "Don't Slaughter a Chicken on Student Work and Other Advice for Responding to Student Writing" by Rachel Shaw. This paper is rich with imagery and great advice, but what stands out the most in regards to my work here with voice and this dilemma I've run into is how Shaw goes about framing the idea of grading and responding to student work. My favorite quote in this regard is where she did real teaching, reaching out to her students through the gentle scratches of a pen, a personal, one-on-one conversation with every student that was simply not possible in the hectic blur of whole class activities and discussions. This quote is in relation to her mom, and I think it does a wonderful job at getting her and my point across. Grading assignments that deal with topics as personal as the ones I've talked about here today needs to be done with grace and intentionality, both things that come easy when we look at grading through the lens of voice. Instead of simply churning out a percentage based on a 12-square grid and a series of checkboxes, grading in this regard is a conversation between our pen and the voices of our students. Our comments have the power to hijack students' work and destroy their confidence and investment, as stated by Shaw. But our comments also have the power to support students' work and bolster their confidence and investment. Voice-based assignments aren't about right or wrong, they're about communication and the efficacy with which our students are able to communicate. Shaw emphasizes that our red ink has the power to let students know that we are listening, really listening, or to nudge them to reimagine what their piece could be, or empower them to return to their writing with new ownership. The best responses to student writing, or to any writing really, are an artful blend of encouragement, challenge, and personal connection, which is another quote from that paper. When deciding on your metrics for how these assignments should be graded, this is crucial to keep in mind. Only you know your students well enough in your class to be able to engage in these encouraging, challenging, personal conversations in ways that are productive. Let your rubric be a discussion board, not a to-do list. Before I sign off here, there's one thing I wouldn't feel right not addressing: a proverbial elephant in the room. This elephant being speech and debate. When looking at classes that are actively a part of public school curriculum, speech and debate pops up as being the closest to doing what I'm proposing, and beyond that, doing it really well. I was distinctly not a speech and debate kid, and 3 years into my degree, I still know next to nothing about it. That being said, I would be a fool not to acknowledge that everything I've mentioned up to this point are existing talking points in the field of speech and debate. When gearing up for this podcast, I dug somewhat deep into debate. Not into curriculum or methods, but into its effects, seeing as my end goal is essentially to inject what amounts to the fundamental roots of speech and debate, the ability of students to utilize their voice effectively and personally, into the English classroom. I figured that It wouldn't be too much of a stretch to expect outcomes in this hypothetical English classroom to be similar to the outcomes of speech and debate. So the majority of my research in this regard goes back to those long-term effects. This is going to be pretty number heavy, so bear with me on this. In relation to reading achievement as measured by test scores over time, students who have ever debated for any amount of time saw a 12.6% increase in test scores. Those with 1 year, 9.7. Those with 2 years, 14.1. Those with 3 years, 8.3. 4 years, 14.4. And 5 years, get this, a 35.5% increase in test scores. Those are objectively non-negligible increases, as pointed out by Education Next, the journal that conducted this research. Furthermore, speech and debate also lends towards higher rates of high school graduation in higher education. Debaters have an 11.7% higher graduation rate and a 13% higher post-secondary acceptance rate, with the largest gap between the average and debaters being seen in students who had the lowest test scores prior to ever debating. Speech and debate, at its core, is an activity and curriculum that is dedicated to doing all the things I want to see done in my classroom. It encourages them to find their voices and learn how to use them effectively at a high and low interpersonal level. It builds community among debaters in and across schools. It fosters teamwork in high-octane and intense situations, and it helps our students become better learners. I say all of this as an outsider and would love to engage in conversations more closely with the field, as there's only so much I can learn from the outside. But still, these numbers don't lie. Voice, to me, is everything. When I realized that I had things worth saying in high school, there was no stopping me. I wanted a seat in any room where people would listen. From student council to theater, I needed to be heard, especially once Black Lives Matter popped up in the midst of the pandemic. I had so much on my chest that needed to be vented out there. Because of this, I place a very high value on being able to communicate whatever it is that I have to say in the best way possible. Language as a concept is unique to humans within the animal kingdom, and by extension, so is the concept of the word and the sentence. The voice is intrinsic to what it is to be human. It's the most direct path from my brain to yours, and as it stands, I'm not convinced that we're doing enough to drive that point home to our kiddos in class. In my ideal classroom, the things I've talked about for the last 40-something minutes are theories that stand side by side with everything else we value as educators of English, because to me, this stuff is just as important. I hope to one day be the one to test my theories against these numbers, to see how onto something I am. Maybe all this is just bullshit that I've convinced myself is worth a damn. Whatever the case may be, I hope I've left you with something to think about as you return to your daily life. Curriculum is constantly changing, and there are hundreds upon thousands of people in this field that think they know better than you do. I don't want to tout myself as one of them, because nobody knows your classroom like you do. All I want out of this is for your students to find their voices, if they haven't already, and to use them to make the changes that they were born to make. I've been Zach Bursch. This has been Say Sumn. Thank you for listening, and happy holidays.